muzzle-loading musket. Now, I agree, that is a bit of a mouthful. Certainly nobody 200 years ago had the time or patience to say, Jared, can you pass me my short-line pattern tire flintlock smoothbore muzzle-loading musket, please? So they cut that down and called it the Brown Bess instead. Brown, for obvious reasons, the color of the stock. Bess is derived from the Dutch boos, which roughly translates as iron tube for shooting, while that became anglicized into the Brown Bess that we know today. But the number one thing to keep in mind about this weapon is that 200 years ago, it is the peak and pinnacle of military technology. Every major army in the world was using a weapon very similar to this by design, because they are very cheap to produce, and it's very easy for new recruits to pick this weapon up and learn how to fire it in a short period of time. Now, this weapon is made of just 3 components. They were all assembled at the Tower of London, so when a soldier received his weapon, he received it quite famously, lock, stock, and barrel. Of course, the 4th component, the one that's kind of important when actually firing, is the cartridge. And that is nothing more than a rolled tube of wax paper with about 120 grains of black powder, and historically a musket ball attached to the end. We do not fire live ammunition here at Fort George, as we do find it cuts down on repeat visitation, so just blanks for you here today. But in order to get at that black powder, you did not have the time nor the free hand to untwist the top. You had to bite into the cartridge. Therefore, when you signed up in the British Army 200 years ago, they would indeed check to ensure you had at least 2 teeth in your mouth. One on the top, one on the bottom, preferably on the right-hand side. But regardless of where they appear, they do have to touch, because if you don't have them, it makes for a pretty lousy afternoon trying to gum your way through that paper. After you've bitten your way through, you are going to pour a little bit of that black powder into a thing here called the pan, which has a shape much like a spoon. That holds what's called your prime. You then lock that into place by shutting this hardened piece of steel called the frizzen. You are ready to cast about and load the rest of the charge down the barrel. And to ensure it gets all the way to the bottom, you push everything down with the ramrod here. And after that, it's kind of important to ensure you put the ramrod back. A step I really can't stress the importance of enough. Because don't get me wrong, you absolutely can fire this thing. Makes an awesome projectile flying across the field and shish-kebabbing anyone on the other side. It does tend to get a little bit awkward, though, when you have to walk across the field and ask for it back. So after all of that, you are ready to fire one shot. Now, this is the machine gun of its day, and a well-trained British soldier was expected to fire once every 15 seconds for a maximum rate of fire of 4 rounds a minute. And I can see how impressed you are by that. Keep in mind, however, that battles were won using speed, not accuracy. So after you're all loaded up, the only steps left are to pull the hammer and pull the trigger. When you do so, hopefully, a few things are going to happen. Hopefully, this hammer flies forward. Hopefully, this flint strikes the frizzen. Hopefully, that contact creates sparks. Hopefully, those sparks fall into the pan. Hopefully, that detonates the prime in your pan. Hopefully, that ignition travels through a small hole called the vent. Hopefully, that detonates the main charge and sends the ball flying off towards your enemy. On a good day. Because there is a lot of hoping, wishing, and praying with a weapon like this because of how unreliable it is in the field. 2 major reasons behind that. First of all, it's the firing mechanism itself. It's external, not internal, so it's very open and susceptible to things like the weather. If it's raining outside, this weapon's not going to work. And there are accounts of battles being called off because it was too rainy and nobody was firing anything. If it's very windy outside, well, the black powder and the sparks could get blown from the pan. Weapon will not fire. If it's very humid outside, the black powder can absorb the moisture from the air, turn it into an inert black goop. The weapon will not fire. If it's Monday afternoon and the musket doesn't feel like firing, weapon will not fire. So there's a whole host of reasons why this weapon will not go off. So many that the British gave it a 30% misfire rate, which is to say, for every 10 times you pull this trigger, 7 times you should hear the nice loud bang. The other 3, a less than intimidating click instead. And the second major drawback to this weapon is the accuracy, or rather the lack thereof, because this is not a rifle. You cannot call it such. Yes, muskets and rifles look very similar, hence the confusion, but on the inside of this barrel, they are quite different weapon systems. Rifles in 1812 are the complete opposite to these things. They're very expensive to produce, very difficult for new guys to learn how to shoot, and very slow that they don't make practical, widespread weapons. Same reason today we don't send all of our troops overseas with sniper rifles. The idea is to give the majority of our men machine guns, so to speak, to get as much firepower across the field as fast as possible. And this weapon does so by firing a 68 caliber ball from a 75 caliber barrel. A massive projectile, even by today's standards. But it's still smaller than the barrel you're putting it down. So yes, that is going to expedite your loading process. However, that also now leaves a heck of a lot of extra room for that ball to bounce, jingle, jangle, and leave at whatever angle it feels like when you pull the trigger, making this weapon only accurate to 75 yards, which is from where I am standing to that palisade fence on your right-hand side. From that distance, we have tested and found you can hit a man-sized target whilst aiming center mass 8 times out of 10. Sounds pretty good, but keep in mind, aiming center mass does not mean hitting center mass. Although quite frankly, if you hit anyone anywhere with a 68 caliber soft lead ball, you've done your job. And nowhere did it state you had to start battle exactly 75 yards apart. So for any extra 100 yards or so that this ball happens to travel, you can theoretically miss your target by up to 9 feet in any direction. So, who here thinks this weapon just plain sucks? I tend to agree, it's the last thing you'd want on a modern battlefield. The true question is then how on earth do they make these things effective with all these limitations? And for that we turn to something called linear tactics. Something you've all seen an example of, you've all scratched your heads wondering why on earth are they standing in big dumb lines just waiting to get shot? Well, I'll put it to you this way. If I gave each and every one of you a musket, we stood in one of those big dumb lines, we pointed and fired these things in the same direction at the same time, we would very quickly discover that the 30% misfire rate and the inaccuracy of this barrel, well, they don't matter anymore. Somebody's gonna hit something. There's gonna be a literal wall of lead hurtling across the battlefield. So I'll be firing a couple of times for you today. I'm going to start with something called the 1804 platoon loading exercise, a slower and more ceremonial load used for new recruits, and then go into what's called the firings exercise, which is the actual battlefield load. For safety, I just ask if you promise to stay on this side of the path, I promise I will stay on my side, and once I'm done, I'll come back and very quickly discuss the secondary weapon of the British soldier.